I got this question recently from someone. What are some different ways you can get more information from an individual participant who says, they say like a one-liner and then they stop and sit back and your gut says, ooh, this is good. So the ones we've been modeling, there's a lot more in my book, Turn the Tide, as well as if you've got any of my other resources, the pairs, panning, ask questions, interrupt, relate, and share. Those are all good tools that can help us build a relationship, create a container where the person may say more. Now, the first thing I might say is, you don't have to, but I'd love to know some more. So using my enthusiasm and passion. And so could you say more about that? Notice I gave them a choice because I have so many privileged identities, particularly facilitator. If you say, tell me more, help me understand, they may feel they have to. And say, you might be done, but I have a few questions. Is that okay? And those open-ended, help me understand, tell me more, could be just ask them to go a little deeper. And that might give you a few more pieces of information that you might then, if they're willing, can ask a follow-up question that might be a little more specific. One way, especially if I'm not clear what they're saying or my gut says there's something there, I'll say, can you share an example or a story? Particularly if they've given you a headline or an opinion. I'll just say, well, can you give us an example? And then when they start telling an example, that's when you can have other people relate in. Because even if they only give you a little bit, like who relates? Can anybody expand on this? Who's got another example? And then that other person tells an example, see if there's any more. You can go back to the original person and say, could you relate to anything anyone else said? And they're like, yeah. So sometimes folks, want more reflective time to be called on, even though I didn't call on them. I asked a question if they're more reflective or an introverted learner. Inviting the group in can be useful, and then they can relate in, and then they might be willing to tell more once other people have shared. They know they're not alone, and that a number of people have begun to get more honest and authentic. If you don't want to go to the group first, you may use yourself as instrument, and then pairs, that's the S, share. And you say, as I hear you, I relate and I remember, or I heard a story recently that was very similar. Does that relate to anything that you're talking about? So again, if you say, tell me more, and they don't give you much, then I would go to, well, you really made me remember. Now I'm thinking about the impact on me was. Any of those, share a little bit more about you, a little more vulnerable. And if you can talk at group level, your example reminds me, every workshop I'm in, I hear folks share very similar examples, like I just heard this recently and this. Here's the patterns of what I see. Does that sound familiar to anybody? As I look back to the one person, see if they want to go first. And if they do, that's great. If not, then I'll go to the group. Sometimes, if I want to stay with that person, I'll say, I could be wrong, but I'm getting a sense that, or I have a hunch that. And notice I ended with, I could be wrong. So they could go, nope. But again, if I offer them something back, as I hear your story, the story I made up is that the next thing that happened was, and then they can say yes or no, or they can just sit there nodding, which means we're probably right, but they're not going to say it publicly. I was on a call recently with folks very senior doing inclusion change work. And I noticed that a person that also does very senior inclusion change work in their organization wasn't a part of their group that had been working together. So I just gently noted, I said, so I noticed we're having this conversation and so is not here. And I'm curious about that. There was a pause and they said, that's perceptive of you. And we can talk about that later. I was like, okay. So the other part I want to emphasize as we're thinking about how to invite participant X to share more is be watching their body cues, be watching their voice, their nonverbal faces. They might be giving you subtle clues like back off, and they may not even feel safe to give you much of a clue. And so sometimes I'll just watch and I'll go, appreciate what you shared. And if you have more you want to share later, I'm just curious about everything. So and then I might say to the group, what I love about this is I can ask questions. You all can ask each other questions at any point. You can just say, that's enough for now. You don't have to answer anybody's questions, particularly mine. So I might use it as a way to renorm the group in case they're worried that I'm going to ask them questions, and that they have agency. They can amplify their voice or have agency by not speaking, however they want. So those are some ways that I use to get more information when my gut says, whew, there's something more there that will really help with learning. Group development could be the aha we need. But again, people always give them a choice to not participate. But then I'd be watching that person, see if they want back in. And at break, I'd probably check in with them and say, hey, how you doing? I appreciate you shared what you shared. And what was the impact when I kept asking? I love that you stopped and said no. And just see how they're doing.